Hello and welcome back to the Harvest Manager Configuration series. In this chapter, we'll be taking a look at the Harvest Use Case Behavior Configurations. The Harvest Use Case Behavior Configuration defines the actual behavior of a use case, including which records or entities will be created or updated, the actual data of the entity to create or update, and validations to perform that can modify the outcome of the harvest use case. This configuration has the following abbreviation in the platform config table: HM Harvest Use Case Behavior. So let's try to define the expected output for this use case. So we have this prompt here, where for the wheat crop, selfing cross method abbrev, not fixed state, when the bulk harvest method is used, we need to create the following entities. First, we have germplasm. And for the germplasm, this is the expected data that will be created. The designation is taking the planted germplasm designation and appending it with -p as a suffix. Next, the state is not fixed. The type is segregating. For generation, we take the F generation and increase it by 1. So for example, if the planted germplasm is an F1 germplasm, then the new germplasm will be F2. For the germplasm name type, we have selection history as the value. And finally, for the parentage, taxonomy ID, and crop ID, we just use the same values as with the planted germplasm. In addition to the germplasm entity, we also need to create the germplasm name, seed, and package entities, all with their own expected data. So we'll be taking a look at these later, but for now, let's focus on the germplasm. So before we do that, actually, let's write the criteria first for our config item that we will be adding to the harvest use case behavior configuration. So as mentioned in our prompt earlier, the crop is wheat, the cross method abbrev is selfing, the state is fixed, and then we have an additional criteria, which is the harvest method. And for this, we'll be using the harvest method abbrev, and that abbrev is equal to bulk for the bulk harvest method. So for harvest method abbrevs, please refer to the scale values of the hvmethDisc variable in the database. So again, this is our working config item for this use case. So we have crop code equals wheat, cross method abbrev selfing, state not fixed, and harvest method abbrev bulk. Next, let's take a look at the components of the config item in the harvest use case behavior configurations. The first thing that must be defined for a config item in this configuration is the harvest type. So we have the following types supported for the configs. The first one is single, and this harvest type generates one set of entities for the use case. A good example of this is the bulk harvest definition. So for all of the bulk harvests in core breeding, we do generate just one set of entities for this harvest use case. So we use the single harvest type for those. Next, we also have multiple, which generates multiple sets of entities based on a given numeric variable input. So an example of this is the single plant selection, which bases the number of records created on the number of plants input. We also have individual ear, which is based on the number of ears input, and so on. Finally, we have the combination harvest type. This is a harvest type that combines two or more harvest methods. A good example of this is single plant selection and bulk. So what this will do is it will take the single plant selection use case and the bulk use case and then perform both of those use cases to produce the output or the final harvest records for that use case. For more information, you may check out our official documentation on the harvest use case behavior configuration, particularly in the config property. So let's go back to our presentation. So for our example, we'll just be using the single harvest type since it's a bulk harvest. So we're expecting to create one set of entities. So that means that we'll create one germplasm name, one seed, and one package record. All right, so let's go back. Now, the second thing or the next thing to define is the entities property. This property is a JSON array wherein each JSON object defines an entity to be created or updated as part of the use case behavior. So later on, we'll be defining entity items or entity definitions within this array here for entities. All right, so let's get to it. So we have the entity definition properties here. So for each of the entities that we want to add to the entities array, we have to define the following properties. The first one is the entity. So this is a string property, and this is the actual name of the entity, which should be the same as the table name in the database. So for example, if we have germplasm, so we'll be adding or specifying germplasm as the value for entity in this entity definition object. Up next, we have the action. Currently, this property accepts two values, which is create or update. So the create action will tell Harvest Manager to create a new record for that entity. And the update action tells Harvest Manager to update a given record for that entity. So since in this case we'll be creating a new germplasm record, the action is set to create. Third one, we need to specify the API endpoint. So the API endpoint which will be used, this is the API endpoint that will be used when we create or update the entity. For more information on the API endpoints, you may refer to the Core Breeding API documentation with the link over here. So for example, we're just using the post germplasm endpoint. So the method is automatically determined based on the action. If it's create, the method will be post. So this is post germplasm. But if this is update, then it will be put germplasm/id. All right. So next, after the API endpoint, we have a Boolean property called retrieve record. And if this is set to true, after an entity record is created or updated, the new or updated entity information is retrieved and stored in a data bucket that is named new. So for more info on data buckets, you can check this documentation. However, later on we will be discussing this as well. So yeah, we'll learn what data buckets are as we go. And then next, the fifth one is the data, which is a JSON object. And this object contains the data items that will be used for the creation or the update of an entity record. In other words, this is the request body that will be used for the API endpoint when we are creating or updating such records. And then finally, we have a validation JSON object, which is optional. So this object contains validation rules and decisions that modify the outcome of the harvest use case. So if you need more information, again, you can check out the Confluence pages for these for the harvest use case behavior configuration. So there are detailed documentation and instructions here on how to define these entity definitions. All right, so far we have this sample entity definition. So this is for the germplasm entity. Later on, we will fill in the data and the validation as we go. But for now, this is what we're working with. Now, let's say, for example, this is my entity definition for germplasm. What I need to do is I will take this and add this to the entities array within my config item. So as mentioned earlier, this is what we have earlier. So we have the criteria and then the config. Harvest type is single, and then we had an entities property, which is just an empty array. But now we've added it here. So what this means is that now in this current definition, the germplasm, we have one entity to be created, which is the germplasm. So that's why we have a check here. And then we need to add more entities here later on for germplasm name, seed, and package, which is what was defined earlier as the requirements for this harvest use case. So we'll fill that in as we go, but for now, let's focus on the germplasm entity. So, well, actually, we have an exercise here. So I want you to, again, take a piece of paper and then try to input or finish this config item here. So we have a sample prompt here. It says that we want to create a seed record. And then we want to use post seeds as the API endpoint for creating the new seed record. Then we retrieve the new seed records info to make it available for later use when creating other entities. All right. So at this point, you can pause the video and try to fill in the missing information in this sample config item. All right, so let's try to solve this together. So you can check your answer later on, but let's try to fill this in one by one. So it says here in our prompt that we want to create a seed record. So to do that, we use the post seeds API. So let's focus first on the entity. So based on this prompt, we can identify that the entity is the seed. So we can edit this and add seed as the entity. And then the action mentioned here is create. So our action will be create. Like so. And then it also says what the API endpoint is. So in this case, we have post seeds. And again, we don't have to put the API method here since it's automatically determined by the action. So if it's create, it will be automatically post. So we just need to specify the actual endpoint. In this case, we have seeds. And then it also says here that we need to retrieve the new seed record because we will be using it later on to create other entities. An example of this is when we're creating the package record, we have to specify the seed ID, which is actually the ID of the new seed that was just created. So that's why we have to set retrieve record to true. And that's it basically. So for now, we won't be defining the data and validation. We just wanted to define the first four properties in this entity definition.